And I'd like to bring in Century International Fellow and International Political Strategic Consultant Dahlia Scheindlin for more on this. Dahlia, thank you so much for joining us. I want to know, what do you think this new law says about democracy in Israel?
I think it exposes the ways in which democracy in Israel was a lot more vulnerable than many people realize. And that's primarily because Israel doesn't have many of the kinds of protections that we see in democracy. And I mean, particularly checks and balances, constraints on the power of the state, particularly the executive, and the legislature are not completely distinguished in Israel. We don't have a constitution. We don't even have term limits. We're a single, unicameral political system. And in other words, all of the kinds of checks and balances you would see in other democracies, pretty much all of them are missing. The two main ones we have in Israel are elections, of course, and an independent judiciary. This is another step towards a less independent judiciary with less capacity to provide oversight or review of government action. I think many Israelis until this year didn't realize just how vulnerable its institutions were, although Israel is engaging in very undemocratic practice for many decades. And so that contributes to a weakening of the understanding of what democracy actually is, and in many ways brought us to this point.
And Dahlia, what will be some of the long-term consequences of this law, do you think?
I think the medium-term, long-term consequences are that the government is now empowered and might try to continue with its package of judicial reforms, or what the critics call judicial a coup or an overhaul. And those would include, the kinds of things they were trying to pass earlier this year, such as a law that would allow the legislature to override a Supreme Court decision rejecting legislation for being unconstitutional, possibly weakening the position of the Attorney General, and of course, politicizing the Judicial Appointment Committee. Very different from the American system, because the American system, even though you have political appointments, has so many of the other checks and balances I mentioned before. The other thing is there are immediate consequences to this law when it does go into force, and it's not exactly technically in force yet. The government will have very few constraints on the kinds of decisions it can make, both for appointing government figures and for firing government figures. This government will certainly want to restore the position of a minister who had been recently convicted of tax fraud, and the Supreme Court ruled that he could not serve as a recently convicted criminal, basically, even though it was under a plea bargain. They definitely want to restore him because he is a political ally of Netanyahu. There is a fear or a suspicion that the government might want to fire the Attorney General, something that has technically never happened in Israeli history. If that, and in any case, that we're heading towards various forms of potential constitutional crisis. All of these decisions can be challenged in court. The very law that passed last night could be challenged in court. If the court should reject any of these things that I just mentioned, what does the government do? There's been so many potential constitutional crises that some legal experts here are saying we are already in a constitutional crisis. That leads to political instability. We're seeing the economic ramifications of this over the course of the year, the weakening of the shekel, the lowering of investments. We're all waiting for the Moody's credit rating agency to publish its updated credit ratings. There's great concern that it could fall. And in other Israeli institutions, particularly the army, where reservists have threatened not to report for duty, senior military officials are saying the damage has run so deep it might take years to undo. So there is a great deal of uncertainty and fear, so maybe on both sides of the political map, but I think particularly for those who oppose the government's plans.
And Dahlia, on that note, we see the mass protests, we see people taking to the streets, but where does this leave Netanyahu? I can only assume that he counts on the support of the people.
Well, what he calls the people and the actual people may be very different things. Israeli society is very deeply divided. It's impossible to talk about any real shared views across the board in Israel, with the exception of things like security. Netanyahu won a majority of parliamentary seats, that is, the parties that make up his coalition, won a 64-seat majority out of 120. However, polls consistently, and I mean every single poll, pretty much since these reforms were announced in January, show that the total number of that the parties are receiving now, the total number of parliamentary seats they would receive, is only in the low 50s. So, but according to all polling, again, an average, I never look at just one poll. He's suffering in the polls, and if elections were held today, his coalition would almost certainly not win a majority. Also, his personal ratings have suffered over this time, very directly linked to the judicial reforms in questions such as who is more suitable to be prime minister. He's lost an advantage that he held for years over other competitors. By the last measure I saw, I've seen he's down 7 points next to one of the competitors. And so, he is, I think, living from minute to minute. Remember, he is currently standing trial in 3 different cases of corruption. And I think his very immediate short-term aim is simply to stay in power, to keep his coalition going. That's why he wants to bring back his political ally who was, essentially had to be taken out of his ministerial positions. That's why many people think that this new law that was passed yesterday is a way of legitimizing corruption in government, because it can allow the government to simply appoint people even if they have corruption or if they have been convicted of corruption. And so, Netanyahu, I think, in a way, he's very strategic, but he also oftentimes, we've seen this throughout his history, sets short-term aims like staying in power and then worries about long-term problems later.
All right, Dalia Scheinlin, thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.